same man I used to be. Something strange has happened deep inside me. So if you see me walking down the street and you start to call my name for heaven's sake, the words you hear me speak might not sound quite the same. 'Cause I'm not the same man I've always been. I might say something like, do you know the Lord?
Do you know him?
I have been in the church to glorify God. So if you see me walking down the street and you start to call my name for heaven's sake, the words you hear me speak might not sound quite the same. 'Cause I'm not the same man I've always been.
Well, I'm not the same man I used to be. I'm 81 years old now. This is a special broadcast, the podcast, and my director-producer, John Hinland's back there behind the camera. And you see we got an extra chair here today, and we're going to be doing a little interviewing today. But this chair today is reserved for my first cousin, David Long. And I've got a little story to tell you about David. Now, my family's a pretty unusual family. Imagine, if you can, and you may hear some names that you know the names but didn't know where they came from. Many years ago in the 1800s, early 1800s, there was a group of Indians called the Illinois Indians, and they were being pushed out by the Europeans. So as they were pushed out and their land was bought, probably with beads and some money, they moved on over, and the people moved in, and they just kept calling the place Illinois. And it wasn't long before, as they pushed them out of the way, the family called the Peorias, they realized they were under pressure, and so they sold for money all their lands. And now it's like starting to be the late or middle 1840s, and they began a long march, and they headed to Indian Territory in Oklahoma, following their chief, Miami. It's spelled Miami. And they settled and called the place Miami, Oklahoma, under their chief's name. And that's where they ended up. And in that place in 1846 was born a young girl who would eventually end up with the name Jency Matilda Jones. European guys, and you can call them Americans by then, they were charged with the responsibility as Indian agents of naming every child. And if you didn't understand the word, or you couldn't read it, or whatever, you could make up your own. I think her name was Mamut, but he didn't know what Mamut meant, so Matilda, little song of the times, replaced it. And she would marry a trapper and kind of a range rider type guy named Ray, W-R-A-Y, and have 6 sons. And the youngest son was William Pascal, spelled P-A-S-C-H-A-L, Ray, W-R-A-Y. And he didn't want anybody to know that he was part Indian. And he came on a wagon train down through Mena, Arkansas. And there in Mena, his little sister, who was about 4 years old, came down with what was the influenza in reality. And they buried her there in an unmarked grave. And then moved on. And he ended up in Fort Worth, Texas. Now, he didn't ride a horse too much because he didn't want anybody to know. He knew how to ride a horse. and he would start visiting a young girl, one of two sisters that he fell in love with, out with a family called the Castleberrys. Now, the Castleberrys, by all terminologies back in those days, were pretty wealthy. And they had two daughters at the time. And while he was dating one daughter, there was a man not too far away named George Washington Long, and he was dating the other sister. Well, here's the humorous part of the story. William Paschal, P-A-S-C-H-A-L, Ray, and I'll explain a little while why I keep spelling that, because I went to R.L. Paschal High School, graduated in 1962, right here in Fort Worth. Doesn't have anything to do, but just an unusual name, Paschal. And so he married one of the Castleberry daughters, and the other man, George Washington Long, married the other. Well, the sisters were close friends. And Mr. Ray and his lovely wife had 4 children. The first one was named Harvey Eugene Ray. Guess what? My name's Elbert Eugene Long. So that's where I got the Eugene. The second one was named Chester Ray, and sadly I don't remember his middle name. But then the third one was a girl. And he named firstly her Leah, after Leah Castleberry. Jency, after Jency Matilda Jones. And she became Leah Jency Long. That's pretty cool. Meanwhile, across town, George Washington Long and his lovely Castleberry wife, were having 2 sons. The oldest, Julian Elbert Long. He didn't like the name Julian, so most of his life he went by Johnny Long. And Paris Long, named after Paris Castleberry. Well, those 2 guys got out there, and of course, being cousins, Johnny Long, or Julian, just liked his beautiful cousin, Leah Jency Ray. In 1911, they ran off and got married. That's right, first cousins, and quickly disappeared and went to Palestine, Texas. And now I have a letter in 1914 where the daughter, Leah, was writing her daddy, William Paschal Ray, and telling him of the impending birth of her son. And also, in one of the letters from 1914 that I have, Mr. Long, Johnny Long, had told one of the guys that wasn't doing much work, if you don't want to work, why don't you just quit? And when he turned around, the guy hit him in the back of the head with a steel bar. Almost killed him. Eventually, he would become the head of the railroad in Palestine, Texas. He was a rowdy guy, a deadly man, and one of my other uncles from another family, my mother's family, said that he was the meanest man he ever met. And he was a small man, and Julian Long he and his wife, Leah, had first Elbert Paschal Long, and of course Julian Elbert had Elbert Paschal, but spelled P-A-S-C-A-L. I found that unusual. And then that's my dad. And then their second child was Charles Edwin Long. And that's my cousin David Long's dad. And then the next girl was Mary Cecilia Long. And finally, Margaret Geneva Long. Those 4 kids. All right. Now, Charles, we're going to just skip it. My dad and at 21 married my mother, who was 15 years old, and they left Palestine and came up to Fort Worth to be around the family. In the meantime, Charles Long went to the Army and eventually would meet a girl by the name of Janice Black. Now, she had other names, first names too, but with Charles, she went by Janice. So Janice Black. And they would move to Abilene, Texas, where he would go to work for the railroad. And they would have the oldest daughter, Theda, and a couple of years later, Linda Kay, and a couple of years later, David Long, and then about 5 or 6 years later, Shelley Long. So it was 3 girls against 1 boy. By 1963, I had gone in the Air Force in 1962 in September. I was stationed permanently at Dyess Air Force Base in Abilene, Texas. And at that point, Uncle Charles and Aunt Janice and the family invited me to move off base and live with them. So with the 3 girls in 1 bedroom, 2 bunks and a single, David and I shared the same room. And he was on the upper bunk and I was on the lower bunk. Well, I'm 19 and getting older, and he's about 11 and just starting to be a Boy Scout. Now, my Aunt Janice was a devout Mormon because she was from Utah. And then my uncle, well, I guess he was Baptist. But anyway, make a long story short, he had to smoke outside and drink his coffee outside because in the house, no Cokes, no tea. It was a real Mormon house. However, he was involved a little bit in the Mormon church, and they had a scout program. Now, a tradition in my family, and you may know as you're watching this, David Long Jr., Eagle Scout, Order of the Era. Well, guess what? Eagle Scout, Order of the Era, that's me too. It's a family tradition. So I became the scoutmaster of the scout troop there in Abilene, Texas at the Mormon church, and helped my little cousin David, who had just turned 11 and from Cub Scouting had gone into Boy Scouting. All right. So there we are. And when 2 kids, because I've always been a kid, in fact, I'm 81 years old now, and I'm still a kid. I mean, really, I'll tell you, I haven't changed a bit. And I had a great time with David, and David obviously had a great time with me. So one thing, and you'll have to believe it, sounds like BS, but it's true. In about 1956, 57, right about that time, and I guess it was 58 now that I think about it, I was a lifeguard, and a Red Cross lifeguard, and my scoutmaster worked for the Army. He had a high position with the Army as a civilian, and they needed a lifeguard for the officer swimming pool. So I became their lifeguard, made a lot of money, had a great time, and met Lloyd Bridges, who was starring in a TV series called Sea Hunt, and I met also Jacques Cousteau. And Jacques Cousteau saw my skin diving equipment that I had and gave me a single hose regulator, which I'd never seen and was unheard of. And Jacques Cousteau basically invented scuba diving. So when you see those old divers from World War II, Jacques Cousteau, and I'm sure if you've got any age on you, you watch TV series. Well, here I come out there to Abilene, Texas. And when you think of Texas, you think flat, dry. Well, guess what? They have a lake there called Lake Fort Phantom. So one of the first things I did was introduce David Long to skin diving. And we had a great time. He loved skin diving. But on one of our adventures, we were out there at the lake. I like to walk along, well, it wasn't walk, I was actually swimming along the bottom. And I would rub my hands in the mud and find rocks and different things. And muddy water, the sifting sands and mud settles on quiet days, there's no wind, and covers everything. And wow, guess what I picked up? An old watch. And when I picked the watch up and I shook it, all of a sudden the second hand went tick, 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 tick. And guess what it was? It was a Timex. So I had a great idea. I sent it to Timex, told them the story, and guess what they sent me back? They sent me back a brand new watch. Well, David was with me, so what did I do with that watch? I gave David that Timex. Now, I don't know if you kids are watching this, if somewhere in all his old jewelry, or ask Sue, his wife, he might have an old Timex. And if he does, now you know where the watch came from. But I taught him other things. For instance, cost a lot of money to use acetylene and oxygen to cut up cars, and I got paid to cut up cars. So I cheated, and I just hooked up straight to a propane tank. It's not as good as acetylene, but it's a lot cheaper. I taught him how to do that. And then I took him with me a lot of times to pick up hay bales. Now, and he was, let me tell you, David was a big, strong kid. And he was chubby when he was little, but hey, that gives you some strength and weight. And so he was paid 3 cents a bale to throw them in the back of the truck. And then when they got the truck kind of full, he would crawl up in the truck and they'd throw them up and he'd stack them. He got 3 cents a bale. Well, you know me, the smart cousin. I drove the old truck and I got a nickel a bale. So we had some good times, and we went out eating together, and we didn't always eat Mormon food. We had Cokes a few times, and David liked hamburgers too, you know. And I snuck a lot of food into our room. Aunt Janice would catch us a lot. I can't tell you how great the times we had. Well, there was some family turmoil over time, and sadly, Aunt Janice and Uncle Charles got divorced and moved away. And so at some point in time, David took it upon himself to move on out, and he did. And he got into the ranching business, and as I understand it, met Sue, and they got married. And they would eventually end up in Los Angeles, where he was when he passed away. And last fall, well, he was going to come up and see me, and suddenly got real sick, and that was, I guess, the beginning of the end. But about 6, 7 years ago, he, with part of the family in the motorhome, drove all the way to Texas, to my little ranch, the 2R Ranch in Palomino, Texas. And they came out there and they brought their motorhome, but not knowing what facilities were available, they stayed in a trailer park, but then they got a car and come on out and visited and everything. And we had some great time and great memories. And he really got a kick out of the fact that I was still Indian dancing, and I got him in Indian dancing back when he was in scouting. And being an Order of the Arrow member, I was a Brotherhood member. I danced until 78, 79 years old. And I had the, and I got a kick out of telling David Jr. this the other day, I had the first and only Order of the Arrow tap out with over 250 scouts at my ranch. And they were all camping out. So you can imagine, I had my own little lake there where they could do canoeing and everything. So David got sick, and the other night I was having dinner with my two son-in-laws, my two daughters, Scarlett and Desi, and the two granddaughters, Carly and Kaylin. And I had an emergency phone call, and it was David, and he said, I really need to talk to you. And so I'd finished dinner. We were eating at a little Mexican restaurant, and I got in my car and turned on my car phone, and David answered. And the first 15 minutes were polite conversations, da-da-da-da-da. And then I said, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm sick. And here's the shocking story. He was in a room surrounded by his wife, his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, and he was dying. And his last request was to call his cousin. And we talked, and we had a great time talking. And I know we talked for about 30 or 45 minutes. And at the end, we didn't say goodbye. We said, we'll see you later. And that's what we did. And the music you heard today is provided, and it belongs to me, by the way, and my group here. It was written and played by Mr. Gilley, one of the famous Gilley family, Roger Dale Gilley, and he was on his deathbed and gave me the CD and asked me to get it published. That's a strange story, because when you got faith, and he went to sleep for the last time, they gave him his morphine and everything, and 3 days later he woke up and said, hey, I'm hungry. And here we are, over 15 years later, and he's still going strong. I just talked to him this past week to make sure the record still belongs to me, and that way I can use it in my podcast. And going back to David and I, we said our personal goodbyes to each other, but we didn't say goodbye. We said, we'll see you later. He's a great man. He did a great job raising a family of 8. Sadly, 2 of the children passed. The one named after me was 2 years old when he passed. And then that left 2 boys and 4 girls. I tell you, this family produces more girls, so the boys don't stand a chance. Well, you're at the funeral right now, David Long, and I hope this added to the funeral. And my producer and director, John Hensland, will be posting this on my podcast. We're going to end it right now. And you guys can go to the YouTube channel and Gene Long's World, no apostrophe, all small letters, on YouTube, and watch John Hensland and my podcast. This is Gene Long. I'm saying goodbye and wishing y'all, I hope you missed David as much as I did. I'll see you guys later.